The origins of the mission did not begin with American planners, but with a collapse. By the late 1982, Libya's intervention in northern Chad had unraveled. After a series of decisive defeats by Chadian forces backed quietly by France, Libyan units withdrew in haste, abandoning airfields, armored vehicles, and entire logistics depots across the desert. Among the wreckage stood Wadi Dum airbase, once a forward hub of Libyan power in the region. When the Libyans retreated, they left behind more than sand and concrete. They left a mistake. Parked on the scorched runway was a Soviet-built attack helicopter, a Mi-25 Hind D, the export variant of the infamous Mi-24. In Afghanistan, this aircraft had earned a brutal reputation. Fast, armored, and heavily armed, it blurred the line between gunship and troop transport. Soviet crews called it the flying tank. To American intelligence analysts, it represented something far more dangerous, an unanswered question. At the height of the Cold War, the United States had never been able to study a Hind intact. Every assessment relied on battlefield reports, satellite imagery, or damaged wrecks. Now, by sheer chance, one sat exposed in the open desert, largely untouched. Libyan leader Muammar Gaddafi certainly recognized the danger. He ordered his remaining air units to destroy the abandoned equipment before it could fall into foreign hands. But war rarely rewards precision in retreat. The order was carried out sloppily. The Hind survived, undamaged, waiting. To retrieve it would require more than airlift capacity. It would demand night flying, long-range insertion, and crews capable of operating deep in hostile territory without detection. That narrowed the field to one unit, the 160th Special Operations Aviation Group. Known as the Night Stalkers, these pilots specialized in flying heavy helicopters under conditions most aviators avoided: darkness, heat, unfamiliar terrain. The soldiers who would secure the airfield and prepare the helicopter came from Fort Campbell, Kentucky. They were heavily trained, tightly compartmentalized, and deliberately anonymous. Time was the enemy. Libyan patrols were still active within miles of a Wadi Dum. Any delay increased the risk of discovery. As dawn approached and rotors began to turn, the mission moved from planning rooms into reality. From that moment on, there would be no margin for error, only the desert, the aircraft, and the weight of a decision made thousands of miles away. By the time the Chinooks reached Wadi Dum, the heat had already begun to rise. Even in the early hours, the desert air pressed down with brutal intensity. Temperatures hovered well above 120 degrees Fahrenheit, turning metal surfaces into hazards and pushing engines toward their limits. For the crews, this was not simply uncomfortable, it was dangerous. As the helicopters flared and touched down, the ground teams moved with practiced urgency. There was no perimeter to fortify, no time for hesitation. Libyan patrols were still operating within a few miles of the airfield, and the sound of rotor blades carried far across the flat desert. Speed was security. The target stood exactly where reconnaissance had reported it. The helicopter's rotor blades and stub wings had already been removed in preparation, leaving behind a hulking armored fuselage resting awkwardly on the runway. It was massive, far heavier than anything the Chinooks were designed to carry internally. There would be no clean solution. The only option was the most dangerous one. Because the aircraft could not fit inside the Chinook's cargo bay, it would have to be carried externally, suspended beneath the helicopter by a sling-load. Under ideal conditions, this was a complex maneuver. In the Chad Desert, amid heat, unpredictable winds, and the constant threat of enemy discovery, it bordered on reckless. Chalk 1 settled into position as Chalk 2 hovered above the prize, rotors beating the air into a choking storm of dust and sand. Visibility dropped instantly. Ground crews worked by feel as much as sight, securing the rigging beneath the hovering aircraft. Any misalignment, any rushed connection, could send thousands of pounds of metal swinging out of control. When the pilots began to apply power, the response was immediate and violent. Nearly 8,000 horsepower surged through the drive shafts. The Chinook shuddered as the load came tight, its airframe groaning under the sudden strain. For a moment, the helicopter seemed to hesitate, as if weighing whether flight was even possible. Then the load lifted. Slowly, deliberately, the massive Soviet aircraft rose from the desert floor, swinging beneath the Chinook like a pendulum. The pilots fought to stabilize it, making constant micro-corrections as wind and inertia threatened to amplify every movement. Nearby, Chalk 2 completed its own loading procedures, carrying additional equipment and personnel. Once airborne, the two helicopters formed up and turned southwest, beginning the long, exposed journey back toward N'Djamena. Below them, Libyan forces remained unaware, patrolling just beyond sight of one of the most audacious extractions in modern military history. Above them, the sun climbed higher, tightening the clock with every passing minute. The most dangerous phase was not yet over. The real test would come in the air. The return flight was supposed to be routine. Once clear of Wadi Doum, the plan called for a steady transit south toward friendly airfields, followed by a transfer to strategic airlift for the journey home. On paper, the most dangerous phase had already passed. The load was secured. The enemy remained unaware. The helicopters were airborne. Reality, however, had other plans. As the Chinooks pressed on, the heat continued to sap performance. Engines ran near their limits, fuel margins tightened, and the suspended load beneath Chalk 1 never fully settled. Even minor air currents caused the captured helicopter to sway, forcing the pilots into constant corrective inputs. Every mile flown demanded absolute concentration. Then, without warning, the horizon disappeared. Roughly an hour from the safety of N'Djamena, the crews encountered a wall of sand rising thousands of feet into the air. A desert storm, dense, fast-moving, and utterly unforgiving, blocked their path. Within seconds, visibility collapsed to zero. The sun vanished. The world outside the cockpit dissolved into swirling brown chaos. Flying blind with an external load was a nightmare scenario. Turbulence battered the aircraft, transmitting violent motions through the sling lines. Beneath Chalk 1, the heavy helicopter began to swing more aggressively, its momentum threatening to pull the Chinook off balance. The pilots reduced speed to less than 50 miles per hour, trading progress for control. Every control input had to be smooth. Deliberate overcorrection could prove fatal. Worse still, Chalk 2 was flying nearby. With no visual references, the two aircraft relied on disciplined formation spacing and constant communication to avoid collision. A single misjudgment could have resulted in disaster mid-air impact, loss of lift, or uncontrolled descent. There would be no rescue in the storm, no second chances. Minutes stretched into an eternity. At last, through a brief thinning of the dust, the pilots found their reference point and committed to landing. Buffeted by wind and nearly blind, they brought the helicopters down hard but intact. The load held. The aircraft remained upright. Against every expectation, the mission survived its most dangerous moment. Even then, the danger did not immediately pass. The sandstorm raged for another 30 minutes, pinning crews in place as grit worked its way into every exposed surface. Only when the winds finally eased could ground teams move in, securing the captured helicopter and preparing it for loading aboard the waiting transport aircraft. When the massive cargo doors finally closed and the C-5 lifted off, the tension that had defined the mission quietly released. There were no cheers, no celebrations, only exhaustion and a growing realization of what had just been accomplished. In less than 70 hours, starting from Kentucky, the team had crossed half the world, infiltrated hostile territory, extracted a priceless piece of enemy technology, and returned without firing a single shot or losing a single serviceman. It was over, and yet, its consequences were only just beginning. From Washington's perspective, the value of the mission extended far beyond the desert airstrip where it began. For decades, American military planners had studied Soviet rotary wing doctrine from a distance. Reports from Afghanistan painted a grim picture. Attack helicopters that could absorb punishment, move infantry, and dominate terrain with speed and firepower. Yet those assessments were always incomplete. Without direct access to the aircraft itself, much of what the United States believed about Soviet helicopter design remained theoretical. That changed the moment the captured helicopter arrived on American soil. Engineers and analysts dismantled it piece by piece. Armor layout, weapons integration, flight controls, survivability features, nothing was overlooked. What they found confirmed some long-held assumptions and challenged others. The aircraft's resilience was real, but so were its limitations. Maintenance demands were high. Avionics lagged behind Western counterparts. The balance between protection and maneuverability came at a cost. These insights did not remain confined to laboratories. They informed training doctrine, shaped threat modeling, and influenced how American pilots were taught to fight against similar platforms. Understanding an adversary's strengths was useful. Understanding their weaknesses was decisive. In that sense, the operation delivered a strategic dividend disproportionate to its size. Internationally, the mission reflected the quieter side of the Cold War's final years. There was no diplomatic crisis, no public condemnation, and no official acknowledgement. Instead, it underscored how global competition had shifted. Intelligence, logistics, and technological advantage mattered as much as armies and borders. The battlefields were increasingly defined by access to information rather than territorial conquest. The operation also revealed the fragile nature of military prestige. A weapon designed to project power had been left exposed by retreat and miscalculation. What once symbolized dominance now sat under examination lights, stripped of its mystique. Within only a few years, the geopolitical landscape that had given that machine its importance would collapse entirely. The irony was unmistakable. Shortly after the mission, the world changed. The Soviet system unraveled. An aircraft that had once been guarded as state secrets entered the global market in surprising numbers. What had required extraordinary risk in 1988 could soon be accomplished with paperwork and cash. Yet that does not diminish the operation's significance. It stands as a reminder that strategic opportunities are fleeting. They appear briefly, without warning, and reward only those prepared to act decisively. In that narrow window, success depends not on firepower, but on judgment, timing, and restraint. Those lessons endure long after the sand has settled. When the cargo doors finally closed and the aircraft lifted into the sky, there was no moment of triumph. No medals were pinned, no speeches were given. The men who carried out the mission returned quietly, their achievement absorbed into classified reports and after-action briefings. For them, success was defined by absence, no casualties, no firefights, no headlines. The silence was the point. In purely tactical terms, the operation was flawless. A small force moved across half the world, penetrated hostile territory, extracted a high-value asset, and withdrew without detection. Yet its true significance lies deeper than execution alone. It demonstrated how modern warfare was evolving away from massed formations and toward precision, intelligence, and speed. The helicopter itself became a teacher. By studying it, American planners gained clarity not only about Soviet engineering, but about their own assumptions. Strengths were measured honestly. Weaknesses were exposed without ideology. The mystique surrounding a feared weapon dissolved under careful analysis. In doing so, the mission reaffirmed a timeless principle of military history. Understanding the enemy is often more powerful than defeating them in battle. There is also a quieter human legacy. Every decision made during those 70 hours carried consequences. Pilots flying overloaded aircraft through sandstorms, crews working under extreme heat with hostile forces nearby, leaders choosing restraint over aggression. Courage, in this case, did not look like heroism on a battlefield. It looked like discipline, doing exactly what was required and nothing more. History, however, has a way of adding irony. Within a few short years, the geopolitical struggle that had made the mission so urgent collapsed. The Cold War ended. Weapons once guarded as symbols of national power flooded international markets. What had demanded extraordinary risk became mundane, yet that does not render the mission obsolete. It sharpens its lesson. Opportunities in history are fleeting. They appear briefly, shaped by circumstance, and vanish just as quickly. Those who recognize them and act with precision leave marks that may never be widely known, but are deeply felt in the institutions they shape. The desert airfield has long since faded back into obscurity. The sand has reclaimed its runways. But the example remains, and it leaves us with a question worth considering. How many of the most important moments in history pass unnoticed not because they failed, but because they succeeded too quietly? If this story resonated with you, consider what lessons it offers for the present. Share your thoughts, discuss the choices made, and join us as we continue to explore the hidden chapters of military history that still shape the world today.